It begins with a boarding pass and a smear of coffee, a simple scrap. Boston, 8 o'clock. I kept it because small objects keep secrets. Today we're going to follow the small things until they lead us to the large, ugly truth. But the truth itself, the single overlooked procedural hinge, we save for the 42-minute mark. We need the facts first. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 4 passenger jets were taken over by 19 hijackers. 2 hit the World Trade Center, 1 hit the Pentagon, 1 crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed that day. Those numbers are how history is measured, but numbers aren't explanations. To understand the day, we follow 3 tracks simultaneously: the hijackers' personal paths, the planes' timelines, and the response, from controllers to military to firefighters. Each track has its own small decisions. That is where the loops begin. Keep an image in your head of one man in the departure lounge at Logan Airport, Mohammed Atta. He checked in, folded a boarding pass, and put it in his pocket. Why is that boarding pass important? We'll loop back to the airport details later. For now, who was he and what route did he take? In the weeks before, he trained on flight simulators in Florida and paid cash for some tickets. Those small gestures mattered. Now the timeline. Flight 11 departs. At 8:14 a.m., Flight 11 takes off. The first unusual thing happens at 8:24, when a hijacker accidentally broadcasts over the radio, alerting Boston controllers. Then, at 8:46 a.m., the plane strikes the North Tower. 18 minutes later, Flight 175 hits the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. These minutes were chaotic, but methodical. The timing and delays matter. Remember Atta's boarding pass? There was also a grainy CCTV clip, a man in a dark jacket with a duffel bag at Logan's Gate C. Airline manifests later showed luggage recovered from Logan that linked back to crew and, bizarrely, to one hijacker. How does luggage survive a crash? We'll get to that chain of custody at 30 minutes. For now, keep the image of the duffel bag. Let's zoom in to the towers themselves: impact, fire, stairwells. For people inside, time stretched differently. The second strike, into the South Tower, changed everything. It turned a tragic accident into a deliberate attack in everyone's minds. Evidence later showed the building's steel framework and how the jet fuel and structural damage led to catastrophic failure. The NIST investigation later mapped how collapse progressed. A voicemail from a flight attendant, Betty Ann Ong, to ground personnel described inaccessible cockpits, phone numbers of injured, and a precise sense of panic. Her call time is a timestamp that stops a clock for responders. Keep her name in mind. We'll hear her words again when we examine the timing between controllers and the military. The Pentagon was struck at 9:37 a.m., the third attack. For years, people ask, how could a defense building be hit? The answer is painfully bureaucratic: radar handoffs, misread transponder signals, and an assumption that any domestic plane behaving oddly was an internal aviation incident, not an asymmetric weapon. We'll unpack the precise handoffs later. Flight 93, boarded from Newark, New Jersey, U.S., had passengers who made a choice. A single phone call from a passenger to a loved one described a plane being steered toward Washington. One passenger, later identified, left a voicemail that would change how people understood courage. Hold that name. It returns at 48 minutes when we examine how passenger action altered a planned target. By 10 a.m., the skyline is a fog of smoke. Financial markets close. The city goes silent in certain neighborhoods and deafening in others. Yet within days, the official response begins. Top-level meetings, lists of suspects, locations of safe houses. Later investigations would ask, how could this happen? The 11 Commission would call the problem both failure of imagination and intelligence sharing. Investigators found a passport, a duffel tag, and that coffee-stained boarding pass in Logan's debris processing after the attacks. How did they get identified so quickly? Because of two mundane systems, manifests and baggage tracking tags. Those tags left a breadcrumb trail that led back to specific passengers, including one of the hijackers. This explains the physical connection between airport and scene, but it raises a question. Why did standard processes survive a catastrophe? We'll use this to test how chain of custody shapes narrative, and then close the loop fully when we discuss forensics at 52 minutes. Now we pause for the human side, first responders. Firefighters, police, and EMS rushed in with incomplete information. For many, the motivation was instinct, save those near you. But some decisions, like who to evacuate first and which stairwell to use, were made in smoke and darkness. We'll listen to one fire captain's log at 34:30 to understand micro decisions that determined survival. The details Betty Ann Ong gave, names, seat rows, the inability to open the cockpit, were transcribed and later used to build the timeline. That timestamp we mentioned, 8:19 a.m., is when controllers knew this was not a simple disturbance. Yet notification to military defense sectors took longer than you might expect. We'll quantify the handoff delay and explain why it matters for interception windows. 5 minutes that mattered, between the first broadcast and the scramble orders. Those minutes weren't empty, they were full of protocol. Confirm, verify, identify target. Protocol worked for commercial incidents, not for suicide missions. That difference, protocol versus intent, is a theme we keep returning to. It leads directly to the reveal we promised at 42 minutes. There's a small memo, 3 paragraphs inside the FAA that was written years before 9/11. It lists scenarios for in-flight emergencies and explicitly assumes hijacking for ransom or hostage-taking, never aircraft as missile. That narrow phrasing shaped training and default responses. Save that memo. At 42 minutes, we show the exact sentence that mattered. For 30 minutes, you saw systems move and people act. The thing almost nobody says out loud is this. It wasn't a single missed phone call nor a single person. The hinge was a procedural assumption written into multiple agencies' playbooks. They simply lacked a category for domestic aircraft deliberately used as a weapon. Because they never imagined that use case, radio call protocols, military scramble rules, and airspace control checked for the wrong signals. In short, the system was tuned to expect criminals or malfunctions, not suicidal, coordinated aviation as weapon attacks. When the real event arrived, the parts did what they had been built to do and failed to stop what was outside their design. Now the consequences. When policy lacks imagination, the decisions that follow are delayed. Confirm becomes hesitate. That hesitation cost interception windows measured in minutes and, tragically, lives. The 9/11 Commission called out systemic failures and a failure of imagination as central. This is not a claim about blame for individuals. It's about architecture, procedures, training, and categorization. Flight 93's passengers, who made calls and organized a counterattack, forced a different outcome. Their choices indicate that human action can change engineered outcomes. The plane crashed in Pennsylvania, not Washington. The exact window where they acted matches a moment when military response could not yet reach altitude. Their courage created a new scenario that changed the day's geography. Investigators reconstructed seating, cell phone calls, and black box fragments. The speed of identification surprised the public. It was the manifest, the baggage tags, and the recovered passport that stitched identities together quickly. That physical breadcrumb trail helped build the legal case against the masterminds who were tied to al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. But the forensic chain also produced controversies that linger. That FAA memo, the phrase hijacking for ransom, is literal in many old documents. Post-9/11 reforms rewrote playbooks to include use of aircraft as weapons and established new joint procedures between FAA, NEADS, and NORAD. The memo's narrow wording changed into broader contingency planning. Understanding that change explains how policy evolved from assumption to scenario ready. What about the longer consequences? For decades, the response remade foreign policy, security architecture, and civil liberties. But we must separate the historical chain of events from the narratives that grew after. The investigations were extensive. The NIST structural reports, the Commission's findings, hundreds of interviews. The facts we're using are drawn from those sources. There's one small artifact left to discuss: the blue matchbox of eyewitness testimony, an off-duty security guard who reported a sighting of a suspicious man near a baggage area 3 days prior. It was noted, filed, and shelved. Why? Because it didn't match the mental profile of threat they were trained to expect. Keep that image in mind. It tells us how human pattern recognition can both save and blind us. We close where we began. That boarding pass, it's a reminder that history is made at the scale of small objects and small decisions. The big image, towers falling, is the end of a chain that began with assumptions, training, and an inability to imagine a plane as a weapon. If you want the annotated timeline and the boarding pass scans I referenced, save this video now. I'll pin the resources in the description. And if you want more deep dives like this, subscribe, because there are other small things that shape history. Thank you for staying with me.